Hello, welcome to Let's H. I'm Hushicho, and I am here to talk about Judas Kiss. If you followed me on Twitter, you saw that I wasn't really very impressed with this film, but I wanted to talk about it because I thought it raised a lot of questions that needed to be discussed, and the reason why I didn't like it. You can currently see this film online for free at Hulu. You could probably see it at various places online, but that's the one that I saw it at, and it was a mistake. It was a mistake for me. The first time I started to watch it, I got about halfway through the credits and I thought, I cannot watch this alone. So I asked a friend to watch it with me yesterday, and I feel bad because I know that I know that my friend was not as unfond of the film as I am. But then again, we don't have the same tastes in film, so I'm going to talk about why I had problems with Judas Kiss here, and hopefully it will make sense. You can see the movie. It's not one that I would recommend because it depressed and infuriated me pretty much. But if you want to go through it and see the things that I was talking about, maybe you'll have different thoughts about it. Or maybe you've seen it. I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below. Let me know. So the story of Judas Kiss is something that if you read a summary, you'll probably think is way more interesting than it actually turns out to be in the actual film itself. It starts off with a vaguely defined creep named Zachary Wells, who is given his colleague, I don't know, Chris's spot as a judge in an important film contest at the film school where they went. We have a start where he's just really awkward, and he tries to impress a dude that he says is a 9, but, no tea, no shade here. This is one of those few points in the film that they really should have implied and not shown, because I just didn't feel like the dude he was talking to was anything special in terms of personality or looks. And I hate to be that shallow, but if you're gonna take us there, at least back it up. At least cast someone that has more of a groomed pretty boy look than our main character. And Zachary is played by Charlie David, whom you'll probably recognize from shows like Dante's Cove and movies like that. He's not a bad actor, he just really needs good direction. This film is an example of a poor script and questionable direction, although it does have some amazing photography. The place where they shot the campus scenes is gorgeous, it's breathtaking, and the clock tower is magnificent. So many of the shots with that, at least the ones that weren't put through a bizarre filter, look really gorgeous. It's very striking. But anyway, the building of Zachary Wells is of course the same sort of typical self-important gay movie crap where he was in rehab, etc., etc., and he's way too cool for school in more ways than one. Zachary doesn't want to go and do this judging thing, but he basically gets manipulated, and even though I tend not to say the word because I feel like overuse of it has made it less important than it should be, but he basically gets bullied into it by Chris, who apparently has to film some new skin flick that I thought Zachary was involved in some way, but I guess not. This is part of the problem with the film. It doesn't really make a good presentation that makes anything clear at any given point, and it's so incoherent and confusing that what little it does give you, it expects you to take at face value at every point that it gives you anything. So Zachary decides he's gonna go after all, goes to a club that looks like someone's rumpus room, and apparently only wears clothes at least 2 sizes too small for him. Maybe they shrunk in the wash, I don't know. They don't suit him, and they are clearly way too small. He has sex with some much younger guy, blah blah blah, you know the story. It's not really anything special to this point. The thing about it is, though, Charlie David has a lot more range than he shows in this film, because the range that he shows is very one note. The character he plays, Zachary Wells, is extremely creepy and unsympathetic, and we have literally no reason to believe anything he tells us. Part of this is because he's such a horrible person, and part of it is because he said multiple times that he went through rehab. His memory isn't reliable, and his accounts aren't reliable. He doesn't even remember this point in time in his life. Trying to set up a character like that as your main source of drive for your narration, your overarching narrative, is a bad idea. Especially if you expect us to take everything at face value. And that's really where Judas Kiss fails the most. It expects us to take everything it presents to us at face value, but we have an unreliable narrator who is pushing the story to move. Richard Harmon, who plays Danny Reyes, is similarly a giant asshole, but he at least plays it as more sympathetic because his motivation seems genuine. You actually end up caring a lot more about him because he comes across like he actually has a stake in what's going on, unlike Zachary, who comes across as just being a dick for the sake of being a dick. Something that I didn't start to think about before I noticed that they were trying to do something cute with the credits at the end was that they said, "Oh, follow your dreams." That would have been really nice if we had seen it at any part of the film before the credits, but we didn't. It would have also been nice if that had given Zachary any sort of motivation. The biggest problem with all of the characters in Judas Kiss is that they have no motivation. They're very one-dimensional. They're incredibly flat. All we have to go on as an audience is that Zachary is a creep and an asshole. We don't actually see any reason for him to be doing the things that he's doing. All we can do is take on faith that things will be better if things happen the way that he's supposed to be manipulated to get them to happen. But he's not even honest with himself. And frankly, again, the only person that comes out with any development or any seeming reason to do the things that he's doing is Shane, who seems to be a huge patron of the arts who is insatiably attracted to artistic expression. Yeah, at one point he tries to tell CW not to make a move on Danny, but this doesn't necessarily mean that he's possessive. We don't know the circumstances of CW and Shane's breakup. All we have is CW's word that Shane is the worst thing in the world, which is not uncommon for people to have the opinion of when they were in a failed relationship. Going off the opinion of everybody knows that guy's horrible in relationships is about the same as the old saying, oh, well, if all the other kids at school jumped off a cliff. That being said, motivation could have helped a lot in sympathetic portrayals of the characters. As it was, none of them really had a compelling reason to do hardly anything they did, much less follow their dream. It would have even been nice to see that as a quote at the beginning of the film, not at the credits that half the audience won't stay around for because they're so sick of it they shut it off at the moment it ends. It could have been worked into the plot in a way that compelled, in a way that drove Zachary to follow his dreams. As it was, though, we didn't even see that he had any dreams to follow. We took it on faith that he was a failure, but they never made it clear what his dreams really were or what he actually wanted to do. Aside from a nebulous, I want to be a filmmaker, that doesn't tell us anything. There's a pervasive tone of slut-shaming in the film, which turns me right off, not to mention basically making sex out to be the worst thing ever. I understand that a lot of gay films depend on sex and sex appeal, but that's also part of the culture. Sex shaming is way more mainstream, and that doesn't make it a good thing. Trying to appeal to that just makes you look self-loathing and awkward. No sex in this movie is ever filmed in an appealing manner, making it a real chore to get through. And pretty much any time anyone has sex, it's used either by that character or other characters to judge, antagonize, or heap hate onto them, usually in a hypocritical way. Now I get it. Sex can be a controversial thing. Sexuality can be a controversial thing. But considering that it really isn't something addressed well in this film, I don't actually understand why they felt the need to present this attitude. Maybe it was just something that happened to be inserted in it because of the director or the writer or the production. Whatever the case, it was a bad choice. And speaking from the hip, I know sometimes people will criticize, especially like gay-oriented cinema, for resorting to full nudity and things like that to keep people watching or to make them kind of soften their opinion of it because it gives you something like it throws you a bone or a boner as the case may be, to keep you watching and keep you interested. To be honest, this could have used more nudity. This could have used more sex, and not sex that's filmed in a way that makes it all awkward and terrible and something to dread because it makes the movie drag. It should have been exciting and interesting and thrilling and something that keeps us watching. Because sometimes if you keep an audience watching or reading or what have you, and this by no means is a universal, but sometimes you will find them actually getting the point of what you're doing because they stayed tuned for this amount of time. Keeping an audience engaged is an important part of making any story come to life. And in this case, it could have really used some full frontal. Not saying, just saying. To get through a film like this, it's really ambitious, and it doesn't actually ever achieve any of that ambition, I feel like. If you're gonna expect us to watch, give us something to look at. A common thread in this film appears to be more questions than the film Prometheus presented without any real attempt to answer. The script is that flimsy. While I find it much harder to forgive a giant, well-funded blockbuster like Prometheus, it's still not easy for me to forgive Judas Kiss because it's so full of itself. This film is literally so far up its own ass you would think the filter that they use is someone's lower intestine. One of the biggest questions that this film never addresses, and it's conspicuous due to that lack of address, who was the original judge? Because, see, I'm going to spoil the film, in as much as the synopses haven't already spoiled it. Zachary is basically going back in time to some supposedly important point of his younger days due to some made-for-stage, low-level effects that we're supposed to just buy into. So the dude he slept with, it's totally his younger self. You'd think you would remember something like this, but as we've said before, he's gone through a lot, and his memory is shit. It's a major plot point, so it concerns me that we are nonetheless expected to take his accounts of things at face value. And he also takes his own memory and his own thoughts about this at face value. Anyway, getting back to the question, who was the original judge? Who was the original judge that he's there to take the place of? Because his friend Chris got invited, but couldn't go. But you would think that there would have been another judge that originally did this. It's just very confusing. It's a very clumsy use of time travel, but that one question kind of stands out. And throughout the whole film, I was wondering, who was the original person that was that judge? What happened to them? What was their original opinion of his work? And you know, he's just one judge of 3, so why would his opinion matter that much? Unless he was doing some serious work to undermine the contest itself, which conveniently is something that never comes up, but I'll touch on that later. Why is the other judge, Rebecca, so agreeable to Zachary? She has literally no stake in him other than as an excuse to brush off the other judge. So why is she so willing to go the extra mile for this guy who only ever really gives the impression of being a giant asshole? He is way worse than the other judge. The other judge is just a little bit awkward. Why are there only 3 judges in this supposedly major film contest at this supposedly major film school? They would have at least 5 judges. And they would probably have a lot of reserve judges just in case one of them couldn't make it. And I know that the initial premise depends on us believing that Chris could just hand off this responsibility to Zachary, but there's probably a lot of procedure that they should have gone through to let that happen. If I'm invited to, I don't know, judge a comic book contest, I can't just pass that off to my great aunt or something. She may not know anything about comics. I was the one that was chosen because I have the credentials and the experience to actually judge something fairly. You cannot just usually pass off the duties in a major contest to someone who may or may not have what's necessary. There is literally no reason why such a supposedly major event would not have backups for this, and would not have some sort of procedure. And on that note, why do these judges never have to apparently answer for anything they do that might be a conflict of interest or bias them? Why is it that nobody ever pursues that at any given point? Not even from the point where, very early on, it's obvious something has happened, and it's obvious that Zachary has no business sitting on the judging board when he has a personal stake. Have they never heard of conflict of interest? You can't do that. This would literally invalidate cheapen and drag the name of this contest through the mud, which is yet another thing that makes it seem like it really isn't that important. Nobody gives a shit. If they gave enough of a shit, none of this would be allowed. Zachary would be out of there so fast his head would spin. They would have 5 judges. They would have backups for everybody that was invalid. And the people in the contest would be well aware that if somebody had a conflict of interest, they could go to the board that is administrating this contest and say, hey, there's a conflict of interest. You need to do something about this. It's not okay. It's not okay. There should have been no end of people willing to step up when Zachary would have rightly been dismissed for any one of the multiple fuck-ups he committed, even just since arriving at the school. But about the contest, how is losing the contest supposed to help Danny exactly? One event rarely ever affects that much, but the presentation doesn't give us any information about what sort of domino effect this is supposed to set into motion. Again, we just have to take it on faith. There are also no other entries that we see or get to know, so it's really impossible to care if he supposedly cheated, which seems ludicrous given that the script we see we have no reason to believe is correct. He has everything to gain, including getting out from under the control of a horrible, mentally unstable rapist, and no other options. I have been in bad relationships. I understand that. But when you have no viable option, it doesn't really help. And the message that the film is trying to present ends up coming across as incredibly sanctimonious. The film basically ends up making the statement that, hey, somehow magically disregard the game of bullshit around you and the very who you know not what you know environment, which is explicitly stated in the film. Don't worry about an actual audience to support this and you'll be fine. Danny may be kind of naive and full of himself at points, which, again, we don't ever see developed. We just have to take on faith, based on a few throwaway lines that may not even be reliable considering who he's talking to. But we have no reason to believe the way the film wants us, other than because I said so, which is bad script writing. The film essentially calls you a whore if you actually have to have support in pursuing your career. I find that unbelievably insulting and sanctimonious and ridiculously naive. But touching back on how much we're supposed to take on faith, which may be what shapes that impression, the script is incoherent, and huge parts of the story are completely missing. The worst part of this is that what we're shown is often less interesting than what is implied to have happened, or what we're supposed to assume has happened, or extrapolate from what happens. All of the characters are assholes. Even the characters that we're supposed to sympathize with. Setting the main character aside in both of his time-displaced forms, Abby knew about Danny's past, yet did absolutely nothing at any point to really help Danny appreciably. She's not really presented as a very dependable friend because, as usual, the film doesn't give us much context or information, which makes her look like a shallow flake who comes and goes like the weather. This may not really be fair to the character because I can see that the impression that the film wants to give us is that she's a good BFF, but their friendship crumbles with one disagreement. That's not a strong friendship, in either direction. And apparently, Zachary just completely fell out and lost touch with her over this? He never mentions her. He doesn't find her familiar to him. It's more along these lines of problematic time travel premise that isn't adequately explored or set up. Nothing seems familiar to Zachary, and his memory is apparently completely gone of the time that he spent at school, so how is it we're supposed to believe he knows what's best for his past self? Similarly, CW, who is only called CW because we're not supposed to figure out who he is in the future, and let me tell you, it's laughably awful how little the actors cast actually resemble each other. CW is actually well acted. He's poorly written, which isn't the fault of the actor, and he has zero chemistry with Danny and his actor. Zero. Absolutely none. It's like he was in a different movie. I have to kind of think that Richard Harmon was the one at fault here because, well, CW was played by a porn star. Chemistry comes easy to him, and I've seen him in a lot of other stuff. He's pretty good at it. He's not a bad actor, whatever kind of films he's doing, and he presented that sort of safe boy next door kind of appeal, and he did have a kind of a one-way chemistry with Danny, who did not return the feeling, obviously. But really, how hard can it be to develop a chemistry with a porn star? whose career is based around at least faking chemistry with people enough to be believable. But this brings us to the real elephant in the room, Shane. This is the rich boy character, whom we are supposed to believe is essentially Satan. He's not a bad guy, though. We have absolutely no real reason to believe that he's bad at all. Nothing he ever actually does on camera is that bad. Yeah, maybe he's a little bit different from the rest of them, but everybody treats him like he's literally taking a shit on the floor in front of them, every scene he's in, every time he's mentioned. We never see him do anything that bad. We just have to depend on someone else's account, someone else telling us, which is a big no-no. Like all the rest of the implications the film makes, it seems obsessed with secondary accounts and unreliable narratives. Show us! Don't tell us about it! We can't depend on these sources, especially for essential character development and plot elements. We see nothing in the film to make us believe that Shane is supposedly so much worse, which at one point is stated, than Danny's psychotic rapist father. Okay, so the big resolution, the film contest. There are so many problems with this. Just the film contest alone, which the film kind of builds up to, is probably the most problematic aspect of this film. First off, there's no way they could confirm wrongdoing in less than 24 hours. There's just too many legal questions and concerns, especially in a supposedly important film contest at a supposedly important film school. Also, procedure. You don't just wait until the slot of the controversial film and make a big scene calling out the entry when you don't really and can't possibly have enough proof to back you up. The film also should not have been slotted there if you weren't going to show it. Just don't show it. Talk to them privately. Say it's under investigation or something. You cannot really even go on with your contest, most likely, until and unless you put those to rest. You either prove them in some way, or if you cannot prove them adequately, you dismiss the concern. I don't care if it's a judge. I don't care if it's a former alumnus. It doesn't matter. But especially when it's a former alumnus who is a judge, who has a bias and a conflict of interest that multiple people know about, and that the contestant could have at any time brought to the proper authorities for address. That is a more significant concern than, oh, maybe he wrote the script before his matriculation. Even if he did, maybe it was just a rough draft. There's probably a rule specifically dealing with that. Of course, again, it's implied, we aren't shown it, we're just told about it. In any case, getting back to the film's slot, what were they going to show instead? Because clearly they were going to show Judas Kiss anyway. One person explicitly says it's already loaded and queued up, so why don't we watch it anyway? Okay. Apparently, Mrs. Blossom, being the asshole that she is, just wanted to make a big scene. Thanks a lot. But getting back to the matter of like the whole disqualification and all that was needed was a apparently time-stamped script, what we saw, there was nothing verifiable about that. We needed more background information if we're supposed to believe that this was a verifiable source for disqualification. It wasn't adequately built up, it wasn't adequately explained, it was touched upon for basically 30 seconds, popped up again once for about a minute, and no circumstances outside of the thing itself were ever explored. If that script were exactly as we'd seen, it would take exhaustive investigation to attempt to confirm it when it was composed, and that would frankly take far more time than the film's time frame, far more than an afternoon. It also must be considered who it came from. His father? Yeah, because they wouldn't be aware of something like that. They would really rely on this source. Not suspicious at all. Apparently nobody in this entire universe has heard of source bias or conflict of interest, or questionable narrative for that matter. But further, it's kind of convenient that the only judge that showed an obvious bias with regards to Danny just happened to be the one to accuse him of wrongdoing, and also, of course, because everybody knew it, happened to be the one that fucked him. So, no one questions the wrongdoing? Even Shane, who is supposedly the most evil thing on the face of the earth, or his supposedly influential family? No? Nobody's just gonna actually call a massive breach of procedure here and demand answers? Everybody's just gonna sit there and go, oh gee, okay, I guess they're right. Yet again, it's a case of even the characters in the movie being given no context or information that they would rightly be owed, and going along with it despite having to make huge assumptions. If they wanted to build up Shane being an asshole, this would be a good point to do that. Or maybe his parents that we are supposed to believe are, like mustache-twirling evil villains because they're influential, show their corruption. Show them doing something that throws a spanner into the smug, self-assured pace of this movie that goes forward, telling its story without any of the characters ever standing in the way. We're never supposed to make assumptions the movie doesn't want us to make, and neither are the characters. We have to rely on the film's narrative as being right when it never actually demonstrates any such thing. And the film that Danny makes, Judas Kiss itself, it's a hilariously self-important, stereotypical series of the level you'd expect at this point. It's awful, but not in a way that makes you think it's tongue-in-cheek or witty on the part of the script. It's very clear that they're taking this super seriously. And considering that the film was named after this film within a film, and it was supposed to be so important and so moving and all this stuff, it's a huge letdown. And then afterwards he's just like, I guess I just wanted to tell everyone. Yeah, but no. You got screwed, blue, tattooed, kid. And that asshole Mrs. Blossom is standing up there like, oh ho ho, what you gonna do? Yeah, how about I have you dismissed because you shouldn't be occupying that job? You are clearly not doing this according to any sort of procedure that would be laid out in a contest this important. Further, like, a mentally imbalanced, predictably rapist father is going to just, I don't know, stroll along tra-la-la and nothing is done? No resolution to that element either? And, when he came to the festival and everything, and nobody noticed him dragging Danny off by his possibly dangerous father. In fact, not possibly, unquestionably dangerous father, whom there would be a record of. But you've got this dangerous dude, and you're gonna walk to the roof with him? Why? It continues the trend, though, of overly facile dialogue, overly facile non-resolution to any character in this. We have no idea what Danny can look forward to because, as usual, it hasn't been built up. No context is being given around the characters, and nothing can be relied upon. And as usual, nothing really amounts to anything. CW assaults Shane, the rich kid we're supposed to believe is so horrible, which we've had no build-up of that, and Shane does nothing in return? Like, this just adds to the fact that Shane is clearly not so bad. He could have easily had CW for assault. He could have beat the crap out of him, too. I mean, this is just ridiculous. The only thing that we have to rely upon that Shane is bad is Zachary's account, which, by his own admission, is unreliable. Maybe he was just unhappy. Maybe they just fell out of enchantment with each other. We don't know the real story. It's probably very different from what we're supposed to believe here. And what did CW's assault accomplish anyway? What came of that? Nothing? We get nothing. You get nothing. You so stupid. I mean, at least at one point we did get Zachary getting socked by Danny, which was less fulfilling than it should have been because the sound production was so bad it sounded like a sack of sardines hitting a pole barn. Oh, yeah, and by the way, I really forgot to mention him because I really hated him, but we have the old man who is obviously future Zachary. They don't even try and really hide it. It's just there and you figure it out pretty quickly. Yawn. It becomes really apparent later, and it's not hard to figure out where they're going with it, but we really could have used some more characters. Like, I understand the need for a limited cast, and I actually tend to like productions with just a few limited characters, just a few limited sets, but in this case it really hurt the movie. Characters you'd expect were just not there. An actual school bureaucracy is completely absent. There's never any indication of them, never even any mention of them. We're just to assume that they exist, but they don't actually participate in any meaningful way in the supposedly important contest. For that matter, no one else exists but the main characters. So we have no reason to be concerned that Danny supposedly cheated, or anyone else to really care about winning in his place. You might argue that this is irrelevant, but it's really not. It would have given us someone else to cheer for, someone else to care about, someone else to be concerned about, because it's not really like Danny is putting anybody else out by winning this contest, which, I might add, if Judas Kiss was the best film that they got, the other films must have really sucked. I hate to say it, but yeah. If you had to win by default because the best film was invalidated due to being slightly out of eligibility, and even that's arguable, but I'm not going to get into that again, then you pretty much suck. Judas Kiss doesn't give us any kind of counter to that. All we must assume is that everybody else sucks horribly, and this is the worst film school in the world. We also have characters like Shane's parents who were well enough cast for their look, but they have no lines to speak of, and they do absolutely nothing. They might as well not be there. Why did they cast them if they weren't going to have them actually do anything? Similarly, we have the third judge, whose only real contribution to the film is being kind of an awkward jerk and giving Zachary and the other judge any real reason for spending time together. But even still, they don't really have any reason to spend time together. And she ends up not actually having much to do either. She could just as well have not been in it. It doesn't matter, ultimately. She doesn't matter. She is so insignificant, ultimately, that it doesn't make any difference. One of the biggest problems in the film as a whole is that nobody's ever really honest with anyone else during it. Zachary wasn't even honest with himself, whether it's his present self or his past self, and Mrs. Blossom clearly knew far more than she was telling. Either she was being honest and she was an asshole, or she didn't understand and probably shouldn't have been allowed to occupy the position that she did. And the less said about Zachary's asshole future self, the better. I don't know if we were supposed to assume that he was changing as the narrative changed and as Zachary's choices changed, but he didn't even need to be in there. So we're supposed to what? Believe that 20 years, 30 years down the line, he's gonna just come back and judge this contest again and be dragged back into this that happened in his youth? What's gonna happen then? Why would he even do that? He serves no actual purpose, much like the other characters I mentioned. The resolution, the ending, is so stupid. It's not fulfilling or empowering or inspiring, it's depressing, sanctimonious, and hateful. Zachary finally shaves properly, even though keeping the stubble is actually more work, but he dresses like he's 90 fucking years old. And he and old Chris are together, and this is better because it doesn't have the shitty filter they used at the beginning of the film. Like, it's another shitty filter, so that's better? Somehow being abusive to his younger self made life better somehow? More of that implied bullshit that they never set up for us. Happily ever after, you piece of shit. Fuck you, Judas Kiss. There's just so much I can say about this film, and a lot of it isn't good. But then the film isn't good. There are some good ideas in there. There are some good concepts, it's just that none of them are actually developed to any level of being acceptable, much less engaging or sympathetic or interesting. The problems with the film distract you from the story it tries to tell, because largely the story it tries to tell is so all over the place and incomplete. It's like we're being asked to peek into the mind of the writer, but he never gives us a window. I don't think even the writer knew what they were actually trying to do with it. It jumps around all over the place and refuses to give us fundamental things that any film should be willing to give us. Any script should give us far more than what Judas Kiss does. You can't just have a group of assholes bunging around in an incoherent slog of a script and assume that the audience is going to get on board just because you scripted it this way and you say so. Judas Kiss asks way too much of its audience, and it doesn't deliver anything in return. I can't imagine that I was even seeing the same film as some people that reviewed this. It's an incoherent, self-assured, smug slog of disappointment, and the only thing you come away with is a wasted hour and a half and some change that you will never get back in your life. It's rare that I dislike a film as much as Sister Act 2, especially as this wasn't a sequel film. You didn't really have anything that was built up to be disappointed about, but in a way that's what truly hurts Judas Kiss. No build-up, nothing to care about, everything is one series of disappointments after another. It's not that the acting was uniformly bad, although some of it was. Characters like Mrs. Blossom, for example, and CW give great solid performances. It's just too bad that they're either bland, assholes, or you can assume, from the lack of tightness of the script, that they're horrible people doing something wrong. When the narrative tries to point fingers that we're supposed to sympathize with the script about, all it does is raise too many questions and make us think that the script is actually lying to us, or wrong about this, or we don't care whether it's right or wrong, because the only sympathetic character in the situation is someone that we are supposed to think is bad, but that the script hasn't done the work to present that. Judas Kiss is one of those that could have really used something more than a rough draft itself. Okay, I'm being shady, but this really needed so many more revisions than it had. It's just not tight enough. And while I'm not trying to promote reliance on tropes and shorthand, the time travel element in this was terrible. It was vague, it was incoherent, and it didn't add anything to the story. They could have made it literally almost anything else, with him re-experiencing or changing things somehow, even done it as a parallel in his adult life, and it would have been better than what they presented. The whole time travel element that they would like us to believe is so crucial to it only raises too many problems and too many questions. But like everything else in the script, too many problems and too many questions seem to be par for the course for Judas Kiss. Give this a miss. It's not even fun with someone. It's just going to make you angry at how poorly it was done and how much better it probably could have been in the hands of someone who knew what they were doing. It wastes our time with actors who are far better for the most part than the material and who are probably being held back by being in such terrible productions. Sad to say, but Dante's Cove was far better at every point than Judas Kiss. Condolences for that, Charlie David. Condolences. I'm Hushicho. If you like this, follow on social media, subscribe to my channel, and consider being a patron on Patreon. See you next time for another upload. Bye.